A German shepherd stood frozen, its golden brown coat matted and torn, tangled in a mess of wire and thorns. A rifle was aimed directly at its head. The dog's amber eyes locked onto mine, a mix of fear and defiance burning in them. My finger hovered over the trigger, and for a split second I hesitated. Why aim at an innocent dog, you might wonder, but this was no ordinary situation. The forest was unnervingly quiet, a silence that felt unnatural, as though the trees themselves were watching. Only the faint rustle of leaves in the cold breeze and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot broke the stillness. Ethan stood motionless, his rifle steady, but not yet raised to fire. In front of him, tangled in a cruel mess of rusty wire and thorny branches, was a German shepherd. The dog growled low, its amber eyes locking onto Ethan with a mix of fear and ferocity. Its golden brown coat was streaked with blood and dirt, and its powerful legs thrashed against the wire in vain. Every movement only made the situation worse, causing the sharp metal to dig deeper into its flesh. Behind Ethan, Jake's breath was shallow and rapid. He clutched a pair of wire cutters tightly, his knuckles pale against the dark green of his gloves. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to shoot it," Ethan replied, his voice calm but tense. "But if it tries to lunge at us, I need to be ready." Jake swallowed hard, his hazel eyes darting nervously between Ethan and the struggling dog. "It looks wild, like it could kill us if we get too close." Ethan shook his head. "It's not wild. Look at its eyes. There's fear in them, not just aggression. It's scared and in pain." The German shepherd let out another guttural snarl, baring its sharp teeth. Its body coiled, muscles trembling with both exhaustion and defiance. Ethan could see the desperation in its movements, the sheer determination to survive. "Jake," Ethan said, his voice dropping lower, "this isn't a stray. Look at its neck." Jake squinted, inching closer despite his hesitation. "What is that?" Around the dog's neck was a sleek black collar, its surface marred by dirt and scratches. At its center, a faint red light pulsed steadily, glowing dimly like the heartbeat of a machine. Strange symbols were etched into the collar, their design intricate and unfamiliar. "That's not normal," Ethan murmured, lowering his rifle slightly. "What do you think it is?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with both fear and curiosity. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He crouched down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate so as not to startle the dog further. The growls deepened, a clear warning to stay back. Ethan studied the collar closely, noting the faint hum that seemed to emanate from it. "This dog isn't here by accident," Ethan finally said. "That collar, it's not something a regular pet owner would use. It's advanced. Too advanced." Jake furrowed his brow, his grip on the wire cutters tightening. "You think someone dumped it here? Like from some kind of experiment or something?" Ethan glanced at him, his green eyes sharp. "I don't know. But this dog didn't just wander into the middle of nowhere with that thing on its neck. Someone put it here, and I'm guessing whoever it was didn't have good intentions." The German shepherd thrashed violently against the wires, its claws tearing at the air as it tried to free itself. The effort seemed to sap its remaining energy, and the dog collapsed briefly, panting heavily. Ethan noticed how thin it was, its ribs clearly visible beneath its matted fur. "It's been out here for days," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to Jake. "Maybe longer." Jake shifted uneasily. "What do we do? We can't just leave it, but if we try to get close, it might attack." Ethan straightened, his expression grim. "We don't leave it, but this won't be easy. A cornered dog is dangerous, especially one this big and scared." Jake hesitated, looking back at the dog. Its amber eyes flicked between the two men, filled with distrust. "Do you think we can even save it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he tightened his grip on the rifle and stepped a few paces closer. The dog growled louder, its body tensing as though ready to strike. Ethan stopped, raising his free hand slowly, palm out. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "We're not here to hurt you." The dog didn't relax, its growls continuing unabated. Ethan glanced over his shoulder at Jake. "Get the tarp from my pack. If we're going to do this, we'll need to shield ourselves first." Jake nodded reluctantly, dropping the wire cutters to rummage through Ethan's backpack. His hands trembled as he pulled out a sturdy tarp and unfolded it. Ethan kept his eyes on the dog, his mind racing through the possibilities. The glowing collar, the strange symbols, the dog's location in such a remote area. None of it made sense. He had been a ranger for over a decade, and he'd never encountered anything like this. "Ethan," Jake said, his voice trembling, what if this dog isn't just a dog?" Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" Jake gestured to the collar. "That thing? It looks like it's from a lab or something. What if this dog was part of some experiment? What if it's dangerous?" Ethan shook his head. "It's scared, not dangerous. But you're right, this isn't normal. We need to get it out of here and figure out what's going on." Jake hesitated. "And if whoever left it here comes back?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we deal with that when it happens. Right now, the priority is saving the dog." The German Shepherd let out another sharp growl, its body trembling as it tried to stand. Ethan noticed fresh blood seeping from a cut on its shoulder, where the wire had dug in deeper. "We don't have much time," Ethan said. "If we wait too long, it'll be too weak to survive." Jake nodded, his face pale but determined. "Okay, what's the plan?" Ethan glanced back at the dog, his green eyes narrowing. "First, we get that wire off. Then, we figure out what this collar is and where it came from. But whatever this dog's been through, it's not over yet." The tension in the air was palpable as Ethan and Jake prepared for what lay ahead. The dog, Max, Ethan decided silently, was more than just a stray. It was the beginning of something they didn't yet understand. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. 4-0. The air felt heavier as the tension grew. Max's growls were guttural, low vibrations that sent chills down Jake's spine. Every time Ethan took a step closer, the German Shepherd lunged forward, snapping at the air, the sharp sound of its teeth echoing through the forest. The wire fencing and thorny branches seemed to tighten with every movement, as if conspiring to keep the dog trapped. Ethan crouched low, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, his green eyes focused on Max's every move. "We need to be careful. One wrong move, and this dog could seriously hurt itself. Or us." Jake stood frozen a few feet behind, holding the tarp like a shield. "It looks like it's ready to tear us apart," he muttered. His voice was shaky, but he forced himself to hold his ground. "It's not anger, Jake," Ethan said quietly. "It's fear. He doesn't trust us yet." Max let out another snarl, his amber eyes blazing with panic. His body was coiled tight, the wire cutting deeper into his golden-brown fur every time he moved. Fresh blood seeped from several wounds on his legs and shoulders, staining the ground beneath him. Ethan knew they didn't have much time. The dog was losing strength fast. "Here's the plan," Ethan said, glancing at Jake. "I'll distract him with the stick and keep his focus on me. You work on the wires, but take it slow. Don't rush, or he'll panic." Jake's hands trembled as he picked up the wire cutters again. Okay, I'll try. But what if he snaps at me?" "That's what the tarp is for," Ethan replied firmly. "Hold it up if he lunges. It'll give you just enough time to back off." Jake nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Ethan grabbed a sturdy branch, its end forked like a shepherd's crook, and approached Max. The dog's growls deepened, his body pressing against the ground as if preparing to spring. Ethan extended the stick toward him, keeping his movements smooth and deliberate. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, his voice calm and soothing. "We're not here to hurt you." Max's ears flicked at the sound of Ethan's voice, but his amber eyes remained locked on the stick. He lunged suddenly, his teeth snapping around the branch with a loud crack. Ethan held firm, using the stick to guide Max's attention away from Jake, who was now crouched behind the dog. Jake crept forward, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The first wire was twisted tightly around Max's hind leg, cutting into his flesh. Jake hesitated, the cutters hovering just above the wire. "Do it!" Ethan said sharply. Jake snapped the first wire, the sound startling Max. The dog flinched violently, jerking his leg and letting out a sharp yelp. Ethan tightened his grip on the stick, keeping Max from turning toward Jake. "It's okay," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You're okay, Max. We're just trying to help." Jake worked quickly but carefully, cutting through each strand of wire. With every snap of the cutters, Max's body tensed, his growls rising and falling like a warning siren. Blood trickled from the deeper cuts where the wire had dug in. mixing with the dirt and forming dark streaks on his fur. "We're almost there," Jake whispered, his voice strained. Max suddenly thrashed harder, his powerful legs kicking against the remaining wires. One of his claws grazed Jake's arm, tearing through his sleeve. Jake stumbled back, dropping the cutters and clutching his arm. "Are you okay?" Ethan barked, his attention momentarily shifting to Jake. "I'm fine," Jake said quickly, though his voice was shaky. He grabbed the cutters again, forcing himself to refocus. "Hang in there," Ethan said, his voice both encouraging and firm. The final wire snapped, and Max collapsed forward, free at last. He panted heavily, his sides heaving as he tried to steady himself on trembling legs. Ethan dropped the stick and knelt beside Max, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay now," he murmured. "You're safe." Max didn't growl this time, but his body remained tense, his amber eyes darting between Ethan and Jake. The dog's breathing was labored, and it was clear that he was on the brink of collapse. "He's in bad shape," Jake said, his voice soft. Ethan nodded grimly. "We need to get him to the rescue center, fast. He won't survive out here much longer." They unfolded the tarp on the ground, coaxing Max onto it as gently as they could. The dog resisted at first, his legs stiff and uncooperative, but eventually he gave in. His body sank onto the tarp, his head resting heavily against the fabric. Ethan and Jake lifted the tarp carefully, turning it into an improvised stretcher. The weight of Max, combined with the uneven forest terrain, made the journey back to the truck grueling. "Watch your step," Ethan warned as they navigated a rocky slope. Jake stumbled, nearly losing his grip on the tarp. "I'm trying," he snapped, his voice tight with effort. Max let out a faint whine, his eyes half closed as he drifted in and out of consciousness. The sight only spurred Ethan and Jake to move faster, their breaths coming in labored gasps. When they finally reached the truck, Ethan opened the back door and carefully slid Max onto the seat. Jake grabbed a blanket from the cab and draped it over the dog, tucking it around him to keep him warm. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Hang on, Max," he said quietly. "We'll get you out of this." Jake climbed into the passenger seat, his face pale but determined. "Do you think he'll make it?" Ethan glanced at Max through the rearview mirror, his green eyes dark with worry. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we're not giving up on him." The truck rumbled to life, its headlights cutting through the growing shadows of the forest. As they drove toward the rescue center, Ethan's thoughts lingered on the strange collar around Max's neck. The symbols, the pulsing red light, it all felt wrong, like a piece of a puzzle they weren't supposed to find. But for now, their priority was saving Max. The mysteries could wait. The rescue center was a stark contrast to the dense, shadowy forest they had just left behind. The bright fluorescent lights and sterile smell of antiseptic filled the small examination room, but the tension remained thick in the air. Ethan stood by the door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, while Jake hovered nervously near the examination table where Max lay. Max's golden brown fur was still matted and streaked with dirt and dried blood. His breathing was shallow but steady, and his body lay limp, finally succumbing to exhaustion. Dr. Lila Carter, a seasoned veterinarian with kind brown eyes and a sharp mind, worked quickly and efficiently, her gloved hands moving over Max with practiced care. "Poor guy," she murmured, her voice tinged with both sympathy and concern. "He's severely dehydrated and malnourished. He's lucky you found him when you did." Ethan stepped closer, his green eyes scanning Max's battered body. "He's been out there for a while, hasn't he?" Dr. Carter nodded. "Judging by his condition, I'd say at least a week, maybe longer. And those cuts from the wire are deep. They'll need cleaning and stitching to avoid infection." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "What about the collar?" Dr. Carter paused, her gaze shifting to the sleek black device around Max's neck. The faint red light still pulsed rhythmically, casting an eerie glow on the table. She frowned, leaning in to examine it more closely. "This isn't a regular collar," she said, her tone growing more serious. "The material is too advanced, lightweight but incredibly durable. And these symbols—" She traced her gloved fingers over the strange engravings, her brow furrowing. "I've never seen anything like this before." Ethan exchanged a glance with Jake. "Can you take it off?" Dr. Carter hesitated. "I'll try, but I'll need to be careful. It's possible the collar is connected to some kind of tracking system, Removing it might trigger something. Jake's eyes widened. Like what? A signal? An alarm? Maybe, Dr. Carter said grimly. Or it could do nothing. There's no way to know without more information. Ethan leaned against the table, his jaw tightening. Do you think it's military? Dr. Carter looked up at him sharply. Military? Ethan gestured to the collar. The design, the symbols, it doesn't look civilian. It feels classified. Dr. Carter nodded slowly. It's possible. But if that's the case, then the question is, what was it doing on this dog? And why was he abandoned in the middle of nowhere? Jake, who had been silent, suddenly spoke up. What if he wasn't abandoned? What if he escaped? Both Ethan and Dr. Carter turned to look at him. Jake swallowed, his hazel eyes darting between them. Think about it. If this dog was part of some kind of experiment or program, maybe he wasn't supposed to leave. Maybe he ran away. Dr. Carter's expression darkened. If that's true, then someone's probably looking for him. The room fell silent, the weight of Jake's words sinking in. Ethan broke the silence, his voice low. Can you find out anything from the collar? Dr. Carter nodded. I can try. The red light suggests it still has power, but it might be damaged. If I can access its system, I might be able to retrieve some data. She carefully unclasped the collar, her movements precise and deliberate. The moment the device came free, the red light blinked twice and then went dark. Damn, Dr. Carter muttered. The internal system's locked. Without specialized tools, there's no way to access it here. Can you tell anything about where it came from? Ethan asked, his tone urgent. Dr. Carter turned the collar over in her hands, examining the symbols and materials. There are no logos, no manufacturer markings, nothing that would indicate where it was made. The only identifiable features are these symbols, but they're not in any language I recognize. Jake leaned over her shoulder, studying the symbols. They almost look like coordinates or some kind of code. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Coordinates? Dr. Carter shook her head. It's possible, but without decryption tools, it's just speculation. She placed the collar on the counter, her expression troubled. I'll send a photo of it to a colleague who works in animal research. Maybe they've seen something similar. Meanwhile, Max let out a faint whine, drawing their attention back to him. Dr. Carter returned to his side, gently stroking his head. He's strong, she said softly. Even after everything he's been through, he's holding on. Ethan's gaze softened as he watched Max. He's a fighter, that's for sure. Jake stepped closer, his voice hesitant. Ethan, do you think this has something to do with that old facility near the ridge? The one they shut down a few years ago? Ethan frowned. The research facility? Jake nodded. Yeah, I remember hearing stories about how it was part of some experimental program. They said it closed because of funding cuts, but what if that wasn't the whole truth? What if Max came from there? Dr. Carter's eyes widened. A facility like that would have the resources to design something like this collar. Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind racing. If that's true, then whoever was running it didn't just abandon the program. They left something behind. And now, we're caught in the middle of it. Dr. Carter straightened, her tone firm. Whatever Max went through, it's over now. He's here, and we're going to take care of him. But you're right, there's more to this than we know, and if someone's looking for him, we need to be prepared. Ethan nodded, his green eyes hardening with resolve. Max isn't going anywhere until we figure this out. He's been through enough. As Dr. Carter began cleaning and stitching Max's wounds, Jake leaned against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His mind was buzzing with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. What kind of program had Max been part of? Who had left him to die in the forest? And most importantly, what were they willing to do to get him back? Ethan watched as Max stirred slightly, his body still tense despite his obvious exhaustion. The dog was more than just a victim. He was a survivor. And somewhere in his past was a story Ethan and Jake weren't sure they wanted to uncover. But one thing was clear. Max wasn't just any dog. He was the key to a mystery that was far from over. The small rescue center, though modest, became a safe haven for Max as he began his recovery. Day by day, the German Shepherd's wounds healed under the care of Dr. Lila Carter. His golden brown coat, once matted with dirt and blood, regained its sheen, and the light returned to his amber eyes. Despite his physical recovery, Max remained guarded, his body tense and his gaze wary around anyone who approached. Anyone, except Jake. Jake had taken it upon himself to visit Max every day. At first, he kept his distance, sitting quietly on the edge of the kennel, speaking in soft tones to avoid spooking the dog. Max would watch him intently, his eyes flickering with distrust, but he didn't growl or retreat further into the corner. "Hey, buddy," Jake said one afternoon, sitting cross-legged just outside the kennel. He held a small piece of jerky in his hand, placing it on the floor near the gate. "I know you're not ready to trust me yet, but I'm not going anywhere." Max's ears twitched at the sound of Jake's voice. His nose quivered as he caught the scent of the jerky, but he didn't move. Jake didn't push him, choosing instead to stay where he was, letting Max take his time. Days turned into weeks, and slowly Max began to inch closer. At first, he would sniff at the jerky cautiously before retreating. Then, he started to take it from Jake's hand, his movements quick and guarded. Finally, one day, Max allowed Jake to gently stroke his head. "Good boy," Jake whispered, his voice filled with warmth. Max didn't pull away. Ethan watched the growing bond between the two from a distance, his expression a mix of concern and resignation. "You're getting attached," he said one evening as Jake prepared to leave the center. Jake shrugged, his hazel eyes bright with determination. "Can you blame me? He's incredible. And he's starting to trust me." Ethan's green eyes narrowed slightly. "You know as well as I do that Max isn't just any dog. That collar, the symbols. We still don't know where he came from or what he's been through. You need to be careful." "I know," Jake said, his tone defensive. "But whatever his past is, it doesn't change the fact that he needs someone now. He deserves a second chance." Ethan sighed, shaking his head. "Just don't say I didn't warn you." Over time, Max's personality began to emerge. He wasn't just intelligent. He was extraordinary. Jake first noticed it one morning when Max reacted to something that no one else could sense. They were walking around the center's yard, Max on a leash for the first time. The dog paused suddenly, his ears perking up and his body stiffening. He let out a low growl, his amber eyes fixed on the tree line at the edge of the property. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, following Max's gaze. There was nothing there, at least not that Jake could see, but Max was insistent, his growl deepening as he pulled slightly on the leash. Jake stood still, listening intently, and then he heard it. The faintest rustle of leaves, far too quiet for anyone to notice unless they were listening for it. "You heard that before I did," Jake murmured, glancing down at Max. "How'd you know?" Max didn't answer, of course, but his reaction stuck with Jake. Another time, Jake left his phone on a bench during one of their walks. When he realized it was missing, he started retracing his steps, but Max didn't wait. The dog sniffed the air, then trotted ahead, leading Jake directly to where the phone had fallen. "You're something else, aren't you?" Jake said, ruffling Max's ears. Max's eyes glinted with a quiet intelligence, as if he understood every word. But Max's abilities weren't just physical. Jake began to notice that the dog reacted strongly to certain sounds, specifically high-pitched electronic tones that most people couldn't hear. One evening, while Jake was tinkering with a portable radio, Max's ears perked up the moment Jake adjusted the frequency to a specific range. The dog let out a low whine, pacing back and forth, as if agitated. Jake frowned, lowering the volume. "What's wrong, Max? You don't like that sound?" Max stopped pacing, his gaze fixed on the radio. Jake turned the frequency knob again, and Max immediately let out another whine, pawing at the device. "Ethan's right," Jake muttered, staring at Max with a mix of awe and curiosity. "You're not just a dog. What did they do to you?" Despite these strange incidents, Jake's bond with Max only deepened. The dog, once wary and defensive, now followed Jake everywhere, his tail wagging faintly whenever Jake walked into the room. One evening, as Jake sat on the floor of the kennel, Max rested his head on Jake's lap for the first time. Jake's heart swelled as he gently stroked the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You're my boy now, Max," Jake whispered. "I don't care where you came from or what you've been through. You're safe with me." Ethan wasn't thrilled when Jake announced his decision to adopt Max. "You're taking on more than you realize," he warned. "This dog isn't just a pet. He's a mystery we haven't solved yet. I don't care, Jake replied firmly. Whatever his past is, it's behind him now. He deserves a home, and I'm giving him one. Ethan sighed, shaking his head. Just be careful, Jake. If Max's past comes back to haunt him, it'll haunt you too. Jake didn't waver. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a survivor, a fighter, and now, a friend. As Max settled into his new life with Jake, the mysteries surrounding his past didn't fade. If anything, they grew more intriguing with every strange ability Max displayed. But for Jake, those questions could wait. What mattered most was that Max had finally found someone he could trust. And as Max curled up at Jake's feet that night, his amber eyes flickering with the light of the fireplace, Jake knew he'd made the right choice. The sun filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Jake adjusted his backpack and glanced down at Max, who trotted confidently by his side. The German shepherd's golden brown coat shimmered in the dappled light, his ears alert to every sound. "This is your first time back here since we found you, huh, Max?" Jake said, his voice light. "Let's hope it's less dramatic this time." Max's amber eyes scanned the surroundings, his nose twitching as he sniffed the crisp morning air. Jake couldn't help but marvel at how far Max had come. The once guarded and distrustful dog was now his constant companion, a loyal shadow that rarely left his side. They followed the winding trail deeper into the forest, the same trail where Ethan and Jake had first found Max tangled in the wire. The memory still sent a shiver down Jake's spine, but today felt different, peaceful almost. As they reached a fork in the path, Max stopped abruptly. His body stiffened and his ears perked up. Jake noticed the change immediately. "What is it, Max?" he asked, his tone cautious. Max didn't respond to the question, of course, but his actions spoke volumes. He sniffed the air intently, then turned off the trail, heading into the dense underbrush. "Wait! Where are you going?" Jake called, hurrying after him. Max moved with purpose, weaving through the trees with an agility that made Jake struggle to keep up. The forest grew darker as they ventured deeper, the thick canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. "Max, slow down," Jake said, pushing through a cluster of thorny bushes. "What are you looking for?" Max didn't slow. He seemed fixated on something Jake couldn't see, his nose low to the ground and his movements deliberate. After several minutes of navigating the dense forest, Jake stumbled into a clearing and froze. In front of him stood a rusted chain-link fence, partially collapsed and overgrown with vines. Beyond it lay the remnants of what appeared to be an abandoned facility. The buildings were small and nondescript, their concrete walls cracked and weathered by time. Scattered around the clearing were pieces of rusted equipment, broken antennas, discarded cables, and a few metal crates half buried in the dirt. Max stopped just short of the fence, his body tense and his tail low. He let out a low whine, his amber eyes fixed on the facility. "What is this place?" Jake muttered, stepping closer. He reached out to touch the fence, the cold metal biting against his skin. A faded sign hung crookedly from one of the posts. The words were barely legible, but Jake could just make out the warning. "Restricted area, no trespassing." Jake's stomach churned. He looked down at Max, who was now pacing along the fence, his nose pressed to the ground as if searching for something. "You've been here before, haven't you?" Jake whispered. Max paused, his ears flicking back. Then, as if in response, he let out a short, sharp bark and scratched at the ground near the fence. Jake crouched beside him, brushing away the dirt to reveal a small metal plate embedded in the ground. It was covered in rust, but the faint outline of a symbol caught his eye. "It's the same as the one on your collar," Jake murmured, his heart racing. Max whined again, his amber eyes filled with a strange mix of recognition and unease. Jake reached out to steady him, his mind racing with questions. "This is where you came from, isn't it?" Jake said softly. "This is why you were out there. You escaped." Max's gaze never left the facility. His body language was uncharacteristically tense, his tail tucked slightly between his legs. It was as if the sight of this place stirred memories that he couldn't fully process, but couldn't ignore either. Jake rose to his feet, his eyes scanning the clearing. The buildings were quiet now, their windows shattered and their doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges. But the eerie stillness felt wrong. What happened here? Jake muttered to himself. Max barked sharply, snapping Jake out of his thoughts. The dog pawed at the fence again, his claws scraping against the metal. You want to go in? Jake asked, frowning. I don't think that's a good idea. Max let out another bark, more insistent this time. He looked up at Jake, his eyes filled with determination. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, fine. But just for a minute. He found a section of the fence that had been pushed down, the metal warped and bent as if something or someone had forced their way through. Jake stepped over it carefully, motioning for Max to follow. Inside the facility grounds, the air felt colder. The buildings loomed over them, their cracked walls covered in moss and graffiti. Max sniffed the ground with fervor, his tail swishing cautiously behind him. Jake approached one of the crates, its lid partially open. Inside were broken electronic components, wires, circuit boards, and a shattered screen. He picked up a piece of the board, turning it over in his hands. The same strange symbols from Max's collar were etched into the metal. This wasn't just some random facility, Jake said aloud. They were working on something. Something big. Max growled softly, his attention focused on a shadow near one of the buildings. Jake followed his gaze, his heartbeat quickening. What is it, boy? Jake whispered, stepping closer. The shadow didn't move, but the sense of unease grew. Jake turned back to Max, who was now standing protectively in front of him, his body rigid and his teeth bared. All right, we're leaving, Jake said, his voice firm. I don't care what this place is. We're not sticking around to find out. He led Max back through the broken fence, his mind racing with thoughts about what they'd just seen. As they walked away, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that the forest was still watching. Max stayed close to Jake's side, his ears swiveling constantly as if listening for something Jake couldn't hear. Whatever had happened at that facility, it had left its mark on Max. And now, it was leaving its mark on Jake, too. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the forest trail as Jake and Max made their way back to the truck. The weight of their discovery at the abandoned facility hung heavily in the air, and even Max, usually alert and confident, seemed unusually subdued. He walked closely at Jake's side, his ears flicking back and forth nervously. Ethan was waiting by the truck, his arms crossed, and his expression a mix of worry and curiosity. You've been gone a while, he said as Jake approached. His green eyes flicked down to Max, whose body language screamed unease. What happened? Jake hesitated, glancing down at Max before meeting Ethan's gaze. He led me to something. Ethan's brow furrowed. Something like what? Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. An old facility. It looked abandoned, but it wasn't just some random building. There was equipment, symbols, the same ones that were on his collar. Ethan's jaw tightened. I told you there's more to this dog than you think, and now you've just confirmed it. Jake shook his head, his hazel eyes filled with defiance. It doesn't matter, Ethan. Whatever his past is, it's behind him. He's with me now, and that's what matters. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Jake, you don't know what you're dealing with. Max isn't just a dog. Whoever put that collar on him didn't do it for fun. If you don't figure out what he was part of, you're putting yourself and him in danger. Jake crouched down, resting a hand on Max's head. The dog looked up at him, his amber eyes filled with trust. I'm not letting his past dictate his future, Jake said quietly. He's been through enough. He deserves a chance to just be a dog. Ethan sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. If this comes back to bite you, it won't just be your problem. It'll be his too. Jake stood, his resolve unwavering. I'll deal with it if it comes to that. Right now, I just want to make sure he's okay. Back at the rescue center, Dr. Lila Carter greeted them with a warm but concerned smile. Jake, Ethan, what brings you back so soon? Jake motioned toward Max, who was staying unusually close to his side. We need your help, Dr. Carter. It's about Max's collar, and where he came from. Dr. Carter's expression grew serious. She gestured for them to follow her into the exam room, where she retrieved the sleek black collar from a secure drawer. The device, though deactivated, still looked ominous under the bright fluorescent lights. I've been trying to analyze it, Dr. Carter began, setting the collar on the table. But whoever designed this didn't want anyone to access the data. The internal system is completely encrypted, and every attempt I've made to retrieve information has resulted in a full wipe of the memory. Jake frowned. So there's nothing left? No way to figure out who made it or what it was used for? Dr. Carter shook her head. Not without specialized equipment or access to whoever created it. All I can tell you is that this collar was built for more than just tracking. The materials, the engraving, the electronics, it's military grade, or something very close to it. Ethan crossed his arms, his expression grim. That doesn't surprise me. We found what's left of a facility out in the forest. Max led us right to it. Dr. Carter's eyes widened. A facility? What kind of facility? Jake described what they'd found. The rusted fences, the abandoned equipment, the strange symbols matching those on the collar. As he spoke, Dr. Carter's frown deepened. It sounds like Max wasn't just a stray, she said finally. If he came from that facility, there's a good chance he was part of some kind of experimental program. And, if that's true... Ethan finished her sentence. Then someone's going to come looking for him. Jake's jaw tightened. They won't take him, not now. Not after everything he's been through. Dr. Carter placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Jake, I understand how you feel. Max is lucky to have someone like you looking out for him. But Ethan's right. You need to be prepared. If this was a government or corporate program, they won't just let him go. Jake's gaze dropped to Max, who was lying quietly at his feet. The dog seemed calmer now, as if he knew Jake was fighting for him. I'll protect him, Jake said firmly, no matter what. Dr. Carter sighed, her expression softening. I'll do what I can to help. But for now, focus on giving Max the life he deserves. He's already been through so much. He needs stability, care, and love. Jake nodded, his resolve strengthening. That's exactly what I plan to give him. That evening, as Jake and Max returned home, the weight of the day's revelations settled over them. Max seemed more relaxed now, lying on the floor by Jake's feet as he reviewed notes about the facility and the collar. But as Jake looked down at Max, watching the dog drift off to sleep, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let the past control their future. Whatever Max had been through, whoever had left him behind, it didn't matter anymore. Max was his dog now, and Jake was determined to give him the life he deserved. No more experiments, no more fear. Just a safe, loving home where Max could finally be free. Still, as the moonlight filtered through the window, illuminating Max's peaceful face, Jake couldn't help but wonder, what secrets was Max carrying? And how long could they stay hidden? The forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Birds chirping high in the trees, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. Jake inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. These patrols had become a regular part of his life with Max, a way to escape the chaos of the outside world and find peace in the wilderness. Max trotted ahead, his golden-brown coat shimmering in the filtered sunlight. His ears twitched at every sound, his nose low to the ground, sniffing for any sign of something unusual. Jake smiled as he watched the German shepherd work. Max had come so far from the frightened, injured dog Jake had first rescued. Now, he moved with confidence, his amber eyes alert and full of purpose. "Find anything interesting, buddy?" Jake called out, his voice light. Max paused suddenly, his body stiffening. He let out a low whine, his nose pressing against the ground. Jake's smile faded, replaced by a sense of curiosity and caution. "What is it, Max?" he asked, stepping closer. Max began pawing at the dirt, his movements deliberate and insistent. Jake knelt beside him, pushing aside the loose soil until something metallic glinted in the sunlight. "What the?" Jake murmured as he unearthed a small rectangular box. The metal was old and tarnished, but it was surprisingly intact. The edges were smooth, and the top bore the same strange symbols that had been etched into Max's collar. Jake's heart raced as he carefully pried the box open. Inside were several yellow documents, the paper brittle and stained with age. He lifted them out gingerly, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded the first page. At the top, in bold, faded letters, were the words, "Genesis Canine Project, Classified." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He scanned the page, but much of the text was obscured or too faded to read. What little he could make out mentioned phrases like behavioral augmentation, genetic modifications, and field deployment. Max let out a low whine, nuzzling Jake's arm as if sensing his unease. Jake glanced down at the dog. "You were part of this, weren't you?" he said softly. "Genesis Canine Project. That's what they did to you." Max tilted his head, his amber eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. It was as if he understood what Jake was saying, even if he couldn't respond. Jake turned his attention back to the documents, flipping through them quickly. Most of the information was either indecipherable or missing entirely, but one phrase stood out on the final page: subjects exhibiting advanced cognitive abilities and heightened sensory perception. "That explains a lot," Jake muttered, glancing at Max. "Your intelligence, the way you can sense things no one else can. They made you this way." The revelation was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Jake couldn't help but feel a pang of anger toward whoever had conducted these experiments. They had used Max, and who knew how many other animals, for their own purposes, discarding them when the project was abandoned. But as he looked at Max now, standing tall and proud in the sunlight, Jake felt a surge of pride. Whatever they had done to him, Max had survived. He had endured the worst and come out stronger. As they walked back toward the truck, Jake's mind buzzed with questions. Who had created the Genesis Canine Project? Why had it been abandoned? And why had Max been left behind? But for every question there were no answers, only the quiet reassurance of Max walking beside him, his amber eyes scanning the forest for signs of danger. Later that evening, Jake spread the documents out on his kitchen table, trying to make sense of what little information they contained. But the more he read, the clearer it became that the secrets of the Genesis Canine Project were buried deep, far beyond the reach of a single man and his dog. Ethan stopped by, his green eyes narrowing as he looked over the papers. "I told you there was more to Max than you thought," he said, his tone a mix of caution and vindication. Jake nodded, not bothering to argue. "I know, but it doesn't change anything. Whatever they did to him, it's over now. He's not their experiment anymore. He's family." Ethan studied Jake for a moment before sighing. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Jake smiled faintly. "Comes with the job." Ethan shook his head, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, if you're going to keep him, you better be ready, because if anyone comes looking for him, they're not going to stop easily." Jake's gaze shifted to Max, who was lying on the floor near the fireplace, his head resting on his paws. The dog looked peaceful. His body relaxed in a way Jake hadn't seen since the day they met. "I'll protect him," Jake said firmly, "no matter what." The next morning, Jake and Max set out into the forest again, this time with no particular destination in mind. They walked in comfortable silence, the bond between them unspoken but undeniable. As they reached a clearing, Max paused, his ears twitching. He stepped into a beam of sunlight, his golden-brown coat gleaming like a beacon against the greenery. Jake stopped too, watching as Max stood tall, his amber eyes scanning the horizon. In that moment, Max looked more than just a dog. He was a survivor, a symbol of resilience and strength. Whatever his past had been, it didn't define him, and as far as Jake was concerned, it never would. "Come on, buddy," Jake said, his voice soft. "Let's go home." Max turned, his tail wagging faintly, and trotted to Jake's side. Together they disappeared into the forest, leaving the secrets of the past behind them, at least for now. Though the mystery of the Genesis Canine Project remained unsolved, one thing was certain. Jake and Max had found something far more important than answers. They had found each other.